Okay, so here's me, Mr. Leary, again, picking up with the rest of chapter 4. And as you can see, some bad things are going to happen to Brian here. He is going to be attacked by a horde, which is a huge group of mosquitoes. So, top of page 36. His clothes were wet and clammy, and there was a faint chill. He pulled the torn remnants of his windbreaker, pieces really, around his shoulders, and tried to hold what heat his body could find. He could not think, could not make thought patterns work right. Things seemed to go back and forth between reality and imagination, except that it was all reality. 1 second he seemed only to have imagined that there was a plane crash, that he had fought out of the sinking plane and swum to shore, that it had all happened to some other person or in a movie playing in his mind. Then he would feel his clothes, wet and cold, and his forehead would slash a pain through his thoughts, and he would know it was real, that it had really happened, but all in a haze world. So he sat and stared at the lake, felt the pain come and go in waves, and watched the sun come over the end of the lake. It took an hour, perhaps two. He could not measure time yet, and didn't care, for the sun to get halfway up. With it came some warmth, small bits of it at first, and with the heat came clouds of insects, thick, swarming hordes of mosquitoes that flocked to his body, made a living coat on his exposed skin, clogged his nostrils when he inhaled, poured into his mouth when he opened it to take a breath. It was not possibly believable. Not this, he had, top of page 37. Come through the crash, but the insects were not possible. He coughed them up, spat them out, sneezed them out, closed his eyes, and kept brushing his face, slapping and crushing them by the dozens, by the hundreds. But as soon as he cleared a place, as soon as he killed them, more came. Thick, whining, buzzing masses of them, mosquitoes and some small black flies he had never seen before, all biting, chewing, taking from him. In moments his eyes were swollen shut, and his face puffy and round to match his battered forehead. He pulled the torn pieces of his windbreaker over his head and tried to shelter in it, but the jacket was full of rips and it didn't work. In desperation, he pulled his t-shirt up to cover his face, but that exposed the skin on his lower back, and the mosquitoes and flies attacked the new soft flesh of his back so viciously that he pulled the shirt down. In the end, he sat with the windbreaker pulled up, brushed with his hands, and took it, almost crying in frustration and agony. There was nothing left to do, and when the sun was fully up and heating him directly, bringing steam off of his wet clothes and bathing him with warmth, the mosquitoes and flies disappeared, almost that suddenly. 1 minute he was sitting in the middle of a swarm, the next they were gone, and the sun was on him. Vampires, he thought. Apparently they didn't like, top of page 38, the deep of night. Perhaps because it was too cool, and they couldn't take the direct sunlight, but in the gray time of the morning, when it began to get warm, and before the sun was full up and hot, he couldn't believe them. Never in all the reading in the movies he had watched on television about the outdoors, never once had they mentioned the mosquitoes or flies. All they ever showed on the naturalist shows was beautiful scenery or animals jumping around having a good time. Nobody ever mentioned mosquitoes and flies. He pulled himself up to stand against the tree and stretched, bringing new aches and pains. His back muscles must have been hurt as well. They almost seemed to tear when he stretched, and while the pain in his forehead seemed to be abating somewhat, just trying to stand made him weak enough to nearly collapse. The backs of his hands were puffy, and his eyes were almost swollen shut from the mosquitoes, and he saw everything through a narrow squint. Now that there was not that there was much to see, he thought, scratching the bites. In front of him lay the lake, blue and deep. He had a sudden picture of a plane sunk in the lake, down and down on the blue, with the pilot's body still strapped in the seat, his hair waving. Top of page 39. He shook his head, more pain. That wasn't something to think about. He looked at the surroundings again. The lake stretched out slightly below him. He was at the base of the L, looking up the long part with the short part out to his right. In the morning light and calm, the water was absolutely perfectly still. He could see the reflections of the trees at the other end of the lake. Upside down in the water, they seemed almost like another forest, an upside-down forest to match the real one. As he watched, a large bird, he thought, it looked like a crow, but it seemed larger, flew from the top, real forest, and the reflection bird matched it, both flying out over the water. Everything was green, so green it went into him. The forest was largely made up of pines and spruce, with stands of some low brush smeared here and there, and thick grass and some other kind of very small brush all over. He couldn't identify most of it, except the evergreens, and some leafy trees he thought might be aspen. He'd seen pictures of aspens in the mountains on television. The country around the lake was moderately hilly, but the hills were small, almost hummocks, and there were very few rocks left to his left. Except to his left. There lay a rocky ridge that stuck out overlooking the lake, about 20 feet high. Top of page 40. If the plane had come down a little bit to the left, it would have hit the rocks and never made the lake. He would have been smashed, destroyed. The word came, I would have been destroyed and torn and smashed, driven into the rocks and destroyed. Luck, he thought. I have luck. I had good luck there, but he knew that was wrong. If he had had good luck, his parents wouldn't have divorced because of the secret, and he wouldn't have been flying with a pilot who had a heart attack, and he wouldn't be where he had to have good luck to keep from being destroyed. If you keep walking back from good luck, he thought, you'll come to bad luck. He shook his head again, wincing. Another thing not to think about. The rocky ridge was rounded and seemed to be of some kind of sandstone, with bits of darker stone layered and sunk into it. Directly across the lake from it, at the inside corner of the L, was a mound of sticks and mud rising up out of the water a good 8 or 10 feet. First, Brian couldn't place it, but knew that he somehow knew what it was. Had seen it in films. Then a small brown head popped to the surface of the water near the mound and began, top of page 41, swimming off down the short leg of the L, leaving a V of ripples behind us, and he remembered where he'd seen it. It was a beaver house, called a beaver lodge, in a special he'd seen on the public channel. A fish jumped, not a large fish, but it made a big splash near the beaver. And as if by a signal, there were suddenly little splops all over the sides of the lake. Along the shore, as fish began jumping, hundreds of them jumping and slapping the water. Brian watched them for a time, still in the half daze, still not thinking well. The scenery was very pretty, he thought, and there were new things to look at. But it was all a green and blue blur, and he used the gray and black of the city, the sounds of the city. Traffic, people talking, sounds all the time. The hum and whine of the city. Here at first it was silent, or he thought it was silent. When he started to listen, really listen, he heard thousands of things. Hisses and blurks, small sounds, birds singing, hum of insects, splashes from the fish jumping. There was a great noise here, but a noise he did not know, and the colors were new to him. And the colors and noise mixed in his mind to make a green-blue blur that he could hear as a hissing pulse sound. And he was still tired, so awfully tired. And standing had taken a lot of, top of page 42, energy somehow had drained him. He supposed he was still in some kind of shock from the crash, and there was still the pain, the dizziness, the strange feeling. He found another tree, a tall pine with no branches until the top, and sat with his back against it, looking down on the lake, with the sun warming him. And in a few moments, he scrunched down and was asleep again. So that ends chapter 4, where Brian is still really tired, and he's finding his aches and pains mainly in his head, his throbbing head, and he gets attacked by the mosquitoes. So not the best of luck for Brian in that chapter, but we'll see what happens as we go on into chapter 5, which you will read tomorrow. So hopefully you enjoyed hearing me read that chapter, and hopefully that helps you with your assignment in Google Classroom. So good luck with that, and I will talk to you later.